I started off my 2026 reading year with a fun new dark academia novel by Ellen Hilderbrand, and it was called The Academy. This novel follows a group of several private school students as they deal with the vicissitudes of teenage life, and at one point the school newspaper publishes an in and out list, which inspired me to make my own in and out list for 2026. So here are my bookish ins and outs for this year, and let's start with what's out for me. The first one that is out is book hoarding. This may come as a bit of a surprise for people who know me and my very large book collection, which at one point was more than 1,000 volumes. However, last year I went through a big move which forced me to grapple with the cold hard fact that owning a lot of books can be kind of a difficult thing to deal with in terms of your physical space. I realized that I didn't actually need to own as many books as I had, and many of the books weren't meaningful enough to me to come along with me on the move, even though I decluttered my book collection a lot, which I made a video about, and hopefully I'll post that one soon. There were still hundreds of books that I took with me, so I think I had more than 1,500 books to begin with. I got rid of several hundred. I ended up taking about 600 or 700 on the move, and actually I did end up regretting taking as many as I did. I really could have and probably should have pared down more. My new place is set up a bit differently from the old one in that in our old place we had this one big wall that was very useful for putting up several bookshelves, so I had this like enormous library wall. The new place doesn't really have a single big wall like that, so I've split up the book collection into separate rooms, and for some reason, not having the impressive display wall also made me realize that I perhaps don't need to keep that many books. Obviously, I still do like to have more than the mere handful that Marie Kondo suggests. I think she suggests keeping only 30 books in her book about decluttering. That I think is not enough for me personally. I like to have a few hundred books, but I think I want to try to keep it at about that level and not go too crazy collecting tons of books in my new place. And with that in mind, I have a brief book unhaul that I am sharing. So I have this stack of books that I'm going to pass along. The first one is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Writings by Washington Irving. I actually have not read this, but it's so down on my priority list. Like it's so far down that I really don't think I'm going to get to it in a reasonable time. I'm going to pass this along. The next one is The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. I read this last year and it was quite interesting, but I didn't love it enough to be like, oh, this is one that I'm going to reread. And actually, that's a theme with several of the books in this stack. Similarly, I would say The House of Mirth, a good book, a classic that is important to read if you're into Edith Wharton, which I do admire Edith Wharton, but this book is really depressing. I don't think I'm ever going to revisit it. And reading it once was enough for me. I used to really have this idea that any kind of English literature classic I should keep because I was an English minor in college and I really liked to have this extensive personal library, but I realized that I was keeping a lot of books that I don't necessarily revisit. There are some books that I reread frequently, but there were many books that I was keeping where I don't really feel the need to reread it. And as I continue to progress in life, it's become clear that I won't actually probably have time to read all the books that I do want to read. So I shouldn't necessarily be keeping things that I'm not like really excited to reread. Here's another example of that. Jane Austen. She's not necessarily my favorite author. I mean, I admire her a lot, but I don't see myself rereading this one. Similar with Richard Powers, this Galatea 2.2. I have mixed feelings about Richard Powers. I don't actually love a lot of his work, although I think he does explore interesting concepts. In this book, there's sort of this artificial intelligence that these scientists create. I feel like a lot of his speculations about technology now feel that they are not as relevant anymore, given the developments that we've seen recently. I did find this to be one of the more moving novels of his that I've read, but I don't see myself revisiting it. Same with Joseph Conrad, another author who I've read this. He's not one of my favorites, honestly, so I don't really see myself revisiting Heart of Darkness, even though obviously it is a very classic text and one that I think if you're interested in reading the classics, you should read at least once. Okay, so here's one that I did not like, although to be fair, I didn't read the whole thing. Philip Roth, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Philip Roth in a bit, so I'll save that for now. There are a few little libraries close to me, so I'll be passing these books along into those so that other people can enjoy them. My next bookish out for 2026 is Dystopias. I actually started off 2026 reading a dystopia by Sarah Langan. It was called A Better World. I did enjoy it. I thought it was quite well written. It was interesting, but it felt too true. I feel like our world is unfortunately becoming so dystopian that it almost feels, I feel like a lot of the dystopian books that are out there, the purpose has already kind of been played out. They felt very relevant in in the 2000s and even in the 2010s when it was still worthwhile for literature to warn us. But we've had all these warnings for a really long time, and clearly no one's paying attention, or the people who are paying attention don't really have the power to change things, or some of the people that are in power are using these as how-to guides. So I just feel like the point of dystopian literature is feeling almost less relevant for me now that dystopia is basically becoming our day-to-day. And also, like, I just don't want to read about it for fun because I'm already reading about it in the news every day. So even though there's so many excellent dystopias out there, and I count some of them among my favorite books, and I thought this one that I started off the year reading by Sarah Lankin was excellent, I don't really want to read more dystopias in 2026. Along similar lines, another bookish out for me in 2026 is I am sick of reading stories about ultra wealthy people. This has been so much like in our various fictional stories, whether it's TV or novels lately, or even nonfiction. You know, there's so many shows like Succession and White Lotus that are exposing the foibles of these wealthy people and showing the inequality. There's a lot of books along these lines too that I in particular read recently. So last year I read both fictional and non-fictional representations of this. In fiction, I read Under the Influence by Joyce Maynard last year, which was one of these classic texts of an underprivileged person brushes up against the ultra wealthy and things go terribly wrong. I also read a lot of non-fiction titles about ultra wealthy grifters and their various failed corporate schemes, from Sam Bankman-Fried to Adam Newman. And honestly, I'm just so sick of it. Along the similar lines of my thing with the dystopias, I feel like people have been exposing this. People have been telling these stories about how bad this inequality is for our society, about how these people have no accountability. They do whatever they want. They can create these massive companies that fail and create lots of social harm, and they can take over our government. People have been telling these stories over and over, and it hasn't stopped them. It hasn't stopped any of this from happening. It just leads to amplifying for me the feeling of powerlessness, knowing that our society is basically entirely structured around class, and that if you're not wealthy and connected, it's very hard to make change or to have power in our society. And I'm just sick of it. I don't really want to read any more of these stories. It's another thing where it's like, yeah, this is kind of being rubbed in our face every single day by the news. I don't need to further experience this in the fiction and nonfiction that I'm consuming. The next bookish out for me in 2026 is reading work of famous writers who I find to be overrated and trying to force myself to appreciate it. So this is where we come back to Philip Roth. Philip Roth is a writer where, because he's considered to be important, he's considered to be a major figure in American literature, I have now read several of his books. I think the one that I enjoyed the most was The Plot Against America. I thought he had the most insight in that one into a really insidious way in which right-wing fascism could come to power in America. That was the most insightful one, but I feel like a lot of his suburban and even urban drama novels, to me, don't feel that insightful. I don't think the writing is that good. Obviously, his female characters are terrible, but I don't love his male characters either. I don't feel that he's had a lot of useful things to say in the books of his that I've read, which have been American Pastoral was the other one. And then I attempted to read The Human Stain, and I just found it so disgusting and poorly written that I got through about 25 pages and I couldn't force myself to read further. He's very sexist in a way that isn't productive at all, where I feel like with some authors, when they're sexist, they have other valuable things to say, so I'm still interested in their work. But with Philip Roth, it's like, I'm not really interested in anything he's saying. I don't think the writing is particularly good. None of the sentences actually jump out at me as being amazing descriptions that I want to bookmark or anything. I just think he's really overrated, and I feel like I've given him a fair shot, and I'm over it. John Updike is another one for me in this category, and Kurt Vonnegut. I know that's controversial, but there's a lot of these authors who I think it's important to give somebody that's considered to be a major figure like a fair shot and to try to understand their work. But once you're a few books in and you're like, you know what, I really don't like this, it's like, life is too short for this. That's out for me in 2026. The final bookish out for me in 2026 is traditional publishing. So I recently completed my debut novel, or actually not so recently because I guess technically I finished it last year. I went on the search for agents and I was not successful. To be fair, I could have kept going. I queried about 50 agents and did not find success with any of them. I think my book is very much not geared toward the market and what's popular right now in YA fiction. It's a YA novel, and the YA market right now is very geared toward certain kinds of stories, which mine is not. It's a story about teenage classical musicians and their struggle for success in their youth orchestra. So the initial agent search was not successful, and then I really thought about what I wanted, and what I want is to put the book out in the world and then move on with my life, because it's been a project that's been going on for several years. Even if I were to continue in the agent search, it would probably take at least a year to get an agent, and then when you do get an agent, the agent then sometimes works with you to edit the text, then they send it on submission to publishers, and then that takes a long time if a publisher accepts your book, because that's not a guarantee. It does happen to some writers, they get an agent and then they don't get a publisher interested in their book, so that process can then take a year. And then if you do get a publisher to accept your manuscript, it takes an additional year for it to come out. So we're looking at like a 2 to 3 year timeline. And when I really thought about it, I was like, you know what? I'm not really interested in waiting that long. I really want to have this book be a completed project so that I can move on to new writing projects and move on with my life. And so that brings me to the first bookish in of 2026, which is self-publishing. I have made the decision to self-publish my debut. It will be coming out sometime in spring or summer this year, so stay tuned for news about that. The next bookish in for me in 2026 is reading lesser known books by famous authors. Margaret Atwood is my primary example of this. She is one of my absolute favorite authors. I love her work so much, but I realized that she has an entire body of work that I've never explored, because most of the novels of hers that I've read have been the really big ones. So The Blind Assassin, which won the Booker Prize, Handmaid's Tale, obviously everybody knows about that because of the TV show and its current alarming relevance to our lives. Oryx and Crake is one of my personal favorites, so I just kind of tend to reread that one over and over, but she's written all these other novels that I haven't even read. So last year I was like, okay, you know what, let's start actually reading the ones that I haven't read. Let's start from the beginning. I started with The Edible Woman, which was the first novel she ever published when she was a very young author, and it was really good. I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to continuing the project of reading more books of hers this year that I have not yet read, and also doing this for other authors who I admire and whose books that aren't as well known that I haven't read. Another bookish in for me in 2026 is nonfiction. I tend to gravitate toward fiction. It's definitely most of my reading, but last year I read several nonfiction books that were all amazing, and I felt really deepened my knowledge of the world. And I look forward to continuing that this year and hopefully reading a bit more nonfiction in 2026. My next bookish in for 2026 is weird and unpredictable books. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like so many books are sort of predictable. They sort of fall into these guidelines or trends. And part of this is that the way the publishing market is currently set up, authors are really rewarded and indeed pushed into kind of writing the same types of books over and over. But I really love it when an author surprises me. This was on my mind because this week I finished reading a novel by Alice Hoffman. It was called The Invisible Hour. She published it fairly recently. It was in 2023. And this book was so weird. And it's quite interesting because when you look at the reader reviews online, people are really divided about this book. And a lot of people hate it, including a lot of her fans. So a lot of her fans online are saying, what is she doing? I really didn't like this. Somebody described it as, this book doesn't know what it wants to be. It's a pretty interesting book. And even though it's not like a great work of literature, I would say I loved it so much because Alice Hoffman was just being totally weird and like really embracing it in this book. And it was so strange. It was so unpredictable. I loved it. It's about this young woman, Mia Jacobs, who grows up in a cult in Western Massachusetts. So it's sort of like one of these would-be utopian communities where it's led by this charismatic, but ultimately kind of evil cult leader. Her mother ran away and joined this cult when she was young because she had an unplanned pregnancy as a teenager and her family was really not supportive. So this young woman, her daughter, is growing up in this cult. It's really restrictive. There's a lot of rules. Like they're not allowed to read books, for instance. And so when she secretly starts going to the library, like that's very bad. So she eventually escapes this cult. And that's like sort of the first half of the book is sort of about this harrowing story of her living in the cult and then escaping it eventually. And then sort of like the scary things where sometimes they try to come after her and how she goes out into the world to make a life for herself. Very compelling story. Really enjoyed reading about it. And then the second half of the book transforms really suddenly into this time travel romance. And I don't want to spoil it, but it was super weird. I absolutely loved it because it was just like, well, this is not the romance that I would write about, but I love that clearly, Alice Hoffman was interested in writing about this. It was very unique. It was really strange. Really enjoyed it. I would give it 5 stars. I would love to read more books like this in 2026. So 2026, give me all the weird and unpredictable books. My final bookish in for 2026 is audiobooks. This is like, I don't know why, but audiobooks are like super controversial. Like a lot of people don't consider them to be real reading. A lot of people say they can't really fully focus when they're listening to an audiobook. I don't find that to be the case for me. I think everybody's probably different, like depending on what your learning style is or your style of how you pay attention to things. I love audiobooks so much, and I've always been an audiobook fan. Like this is not a new thing for me, but I feel like since the beginning of 2026, my audiobook consumption has ramped up even more. Right now I have like 5 different audiobooks on my phone, and it's nice because I'm switching between them. I'll be listening to a murder mystery, and then when I'm like, you know what, I've had enough of that, I'm also listening to Ask Not, which is this expose of how the Kennedy family has treated women over time. It's actually really refreshing because I have felt for a long time that there's a lot of lack of accountability there, and this book is really harsh and it really drags those things out, so I'm loving it. When that's a little too heavy, I'm like, okay, let's switch back to like a mystery or this Alice Hoffman time travel romance. Also, who has time to actually sit down and read? Like, that's what I don't understand. People that are very strict about, oh, it doesn't count as reading, you have to actually sit down and physically read the book. I'm sorry, but I do not have time for that. Yes, I'm a person who has lots of paperback books, and I enjoy reading paperbacks when I have the time, but I don't have the time a lot of the time. I'm a busy person. I work, I hike, I travel. I recently started baking, which is a new hobby for me. It's like I'm always out and about doing stuff, and I don't really have a lot of time to sit down and like physically read a book. And if that were the only way I allowed myself to read, I would read way fewer books. So audiobooks are really in for me. I love audiobooks. Give me all the audiobooks, and I look forward to listening to tons of them in 2026. Do you have bookish ins or outs for 2026? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.